This is Houston, contact with a test. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. End of test.
Discovery, Houston. Recommend vector transfer to the BFS.
Discovery's 4 computers now have primary control of critical vehicle functions.
Gillespugin, sitting in front of the computer, is trying to type. He places both hands above the keyboard. He gives up, exhausted, and his hands drop into his lap. After resting for a time, he raises his hands again, only to drop them as before.
My definition of electronic literature is, I want to say stories, because I always associate stories with literature. And electronic means that there has been either some intervention in the authoring process, which involves digital technology, or in the delivery process, which has digital technology.
I try to recall winter as if it were yesterday, she says, but I do not signify one way or another. By 5 the sun sets and the afternoon melt freezes again across the blacktop into crystal octopi and palms of ice, rivers and continents beset by fear, and we walk out to the car, the snow moaning beneath our boots and the oaks exploding in series along the fence line on the horizon, the shrapnel settling like relics, the echoing thundering off far ice. This was the essence of wood, these fragments say, and this darkness is air. Poetry, she says, without emotion, one way or another. I wrote this in Michigan. I actually can remember the sound of, on freezing days, they may not have been oaks exploding, but the trees kind of popping off along the ridge. And I remember also having walked to my office and seen the afternoon melt freezing across the blacktop like crystal octopi. I'm having an incredible deja vu looking at the screen.
My definition of electronic literature would be any form of writing that is dynamic, meaning it can be collaborated on or edited or changed at will.
A check tablecloth laid in an isolated clearing. A bottle of red wine, 2 glasses, cheese, and bread. Walking the sound of water, weight-capped the sound of water. A bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon set on a linen tablecloth. Set on a linen tablecloth. Cold water. Crystal goblets unexpectedly at midnight. Purple lupine on the hillside. Beside the Dempsey dumpster in town, walking down to the water where the homeless gathered. A flower dress, unexpected woodland events. Weight-capped spring water in winter. A bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon set on a linen tablecloth. Cold water. A flower dress. The smell of hops and honey. The smell of green grass. Outflow of stones by the river. The smell of green grass. Under the eaves of the river. The cabin where we were working. The sound of water. White-capped mountains. Purple lupine on the hillside. Making love.
Electronic literature is forms of literature that make use of the computer or the network context to achieve effects that wouldn't be possible in print.
My birth takes place more than once in the plea of a bygone monster, from a muddy hole by corpse light, under the needle and under the pen. Or it took place not at all. But if I hope to tell a good story, I must leapfrog out of the muddle of my several births, to the day I parted for the last time with the author of my being and set out to write my own destiny.
So it might start with smell when that's possible in the future. At present it starts with image very dominantly and proceeds through text to sound in kind of a hierarchy, which I very much dislike. But I think the opportunities within that for interaction between those different senses and different means of generating stuff are just fantastic, particularly when we bring similar algorithms to bear on all of them. And we see their interactions both at the code, the sonic, the visual and the meaning level.
Electronic literature is the exploration of concepts beyond the ordinary using electronic means, and in traditional vision-based media you have moving pictures, you have more traditional genres such as, printed text where things don't move around, but electronic literature involves exploring how we take concepts, how we perceive the world and ourselves, and trying to portray that using computation, using the specific processes that are unique to computers.
There are two main literary parents for me, for the fiction, and one of them is Thomas Pynchon, and Gravity's Rainbow, which is a novel which contains within it music hall numbers, popular songs, equation. There are no visible artworks, but there is a tremendous reference to the language of art and film and music and theater, and that was a mental model for me that the novel did not.
Hello and welcome to the live stream traversal of Michael Joyce's Twilight, a Symphony, hosted by the Electronic Literature Lab at Washington State University, Vancouver. I am Mariusz Pisarski, research affiliate at the lab and hypertext scholar. With me remotely is Michael Joyce, Astrid Enslin, and Dini Grigar, the director of the lab, who at the lab will be operating our main computer. Michael will be guiding Dini remotely via YouTube and Zoom while he reads from Dini's computer screen. For the playthrough, we will be using the lampshade iMac running system 9.2. Following the performance, there will be a Q&A with Michael, Dini, Astrid, and me. As a participant in the event, all of you will be able, of course, to post questions in the YouTube chat to the author, who will then respond in the Q&A. Michael Joyce's Twilight, a Symphony was published by Eastgate Systems in 1996 on CD-ROM for Macintosh computers. Although Windows edition was announced on release, no subsequent editions exist apart from the online edition in Polish from 2015. As a result, the author used to call Twilight my great lost work. If we compare this hypertext with Joyce's famous Afternoon a Story, a few changes need to be mentioned. Firstly, every window is simultaneously represented on the story space map view. This is now open to the reader. And this allows for a spatial alternative exploration. Secondly, the default way of reading by pressing the Enter key is replaced by the directional panel on the small toolbar. And thirdly, Twilight, a Symphony uses the then new feature of story space random links. As a result, the order of narrative sequences is much less predictable. This feature comes hand in hand with the work's narrative design based on returns, refrains, and repetitions, just as in the musical form of symphony, which Twilight refers to in its title. Only by returns of themes, faces, sounds, photographs, and hand-drawn illustrations, one can actually grasp a glimpse of signifying totality. The audiovisual elements are important. Astrid Enslin regards Twilight as a prime example of hypermedia of the first generation e-literature. But of course, most captivating and beautifully married to the hypertext form are the stories themselves. Susanna Tosca called Twilight an impressive scaffolding made up of voices, memories, and thoughts that tell us about the eternal human themes, death, and the search for the self. I want to acknowledge the contributions of the many staff members of the lab and faculty members of the Creative Media and Digital Culture program who have made this event possible. Greg Philbrook, the lab and program study guru, is handling YouTube Live and OBS. Holly Slocum, the lab's project manager, is overseeing the project. Catherine Zoller, the lab's undergraduate researcher, is managing the social media posting on Twitter. Dr. John Barber is handling the sound production, and Professor Debbie Alonso is taking care of post-production editing of the video capture. I learned that the video captured from today's traversal will be edited and placed on the lab's Vimeo channel and added to the lab's annual publication, Rebooting Electronic Literature. Without further delay, let's begin the traversal. Good morning, Michael. Good morning, Astrid. Good morning, Dee.
Good morning, everyone.
We now should have be seeing a screen from Dini's computer screen.
There's a little bit of a lag.
And the work will be loaded. The CD is in the computer, and we begin a reading.
I do want to say, while it's loading, a few words about about the dedication of Mildred and Yasmina Pavic, who was honored enough to become friends with briefly for a while, and to whom I dedicated this work. A remarkable hypertextual writer in print himself. While this screen is on, I also want to thank the people who provided the music and the video for at various points in this in the work. Kate Warmby, Alison Clench, and Bridget Hales, who were students of mine at Vassar College, and the band Two Trips Later, who I never knew, but I've had a chance to kind of discover as the years have gone on.
By the way, have you ever met Milorad Pavic, or it was email correspondence?
It was correspondence, really, about the Khazars, about the Khazars book, and it was a pretty intense correspondence because of what was happening in his country during those days.
Okay.
So we're ready to begin. Before I begin reading, let me just briefly say how honored I am to be here. It feels like home at ELL. I'm happy to have my traversal join with the other wonderful traversals that are already here. I'm even happier that ELL will house Mariusz's remarkable porting, retranslation of this to English in coming days. As I read this, I should point out that I haven't seen the work, and I saw it a few days ago when we rehearsed, but I haven't seen the work as it exists for more than a decade, and I'm deeply grateful to Mariusz for making that possible. I also want to thank, speaking of making it possible, Dini, who I worship, her group, Greg and Howie, who make things wonderful, and the wonderful critic Astrid Enselid, who I've been reading for years and years, and I'm so happy will join us for questions. So I'm going to start reading now. Our story so far. As in most stories, a lot has happened before you got here. As was always true, but it's increasingly true in stories like this. A good deal more will happen now that you're here. Here's what I know so far. The stories, insofar as there are stories here, move in two central arcs, east toward life, though in the past, and west toward death, though in the future. Above these is something like a dream or mind, a set of sometimes fragmentary, sometimes speculative linkages with their own arcs. Below, in something approximating the present moment of the shifting text, is the beginning of a story. This story begins toward its end, and yet well after the end of one of the histories, called Pleasant Lake, and a bit beyond the end of the song sequence, which takes place on the shores of another lake, the vast Superior, in a small Canadian town called Marathon. In that eastward story, a man named Hugh, following the death of his mother, childnaps his infant son from his estranged wife, leaving behind a Cabbage Patch doll for their older daughter, foolishly intending this as a gift, not in any sense a replacement. And he becomes a victim of a media age and his own arrogance. This act leads to enormous publicity surrounding in the early 1980s, then novel, childnapping. Fearing discovery and apprehension, this man flees to his brother's remote cottage on Pleasant Lake in New York, where he meets a recent emigre from Poland, a poet and former Solidarity activist now working as a pawn shop clerk and near indenture to his American sponsors, whose shack of a, quote, cottage he occupies with his former lawyer wife, Magdalena, and their son. In the westward story, nearly a decade older, the same man has been contacted by Magdalena, whom he claims not to have seen in the intervening years, and whose link to him is a single word. Suffering from a rare cancer which infects the blood, she begs his help. He accompanies her on a fruitless quest around the shore of Lake Superior and across Ontario toward Hibbings, Minnesota, where she hopes to enlist the aid of the, quote, Twilight doctor, an increasingly notorious small-town doctor committed to assisting dying patients who wish to commit suicide. As they begin their quest, neither know that the Twilight doctor is himself heading east toward a conference in Montreal, ironically booked as a passenger on a lake freighter, which passes them as they sit by the frigid shore near Sault Ste. Marie. When they discover this, Hugh agrees to help Magdalena end her own life. A little refresh coming here. While I'm waiting for the refresh, I would say that the Twilight Doctor obviously is based on Jack Kevorkian. Here. Having been here once, now once again. Having been here once, here now, once again. One could actually reach and touch where in the air, there, before the eyes, the center of the body had been bound by bone staves, heavy kettle of innards slung below cosseted bellows. Reach where once a winged shoulder moved at eye level, so surely there one could lay one's head against the scent of the past itself. Nestle in memory, cradle recurrence between curved palms. One really passed here once before, each interval of space sprocketed, gelled, sound-striped, imperceptibly variable, yet not film, but real life. Or if not that, time itself, imprinted in air and fragrant earth, that snake-like mark in the still damp mud, where the tire press beneath one's weight marks the passage not of time, but of the meaning of a life. A phrase as weighty and as lost as the echo of one's passing, passage, past. I tread here once and am once again. What could this mean? My daughter was in my stomach once. Young men's variations on the same knave a dying man did once. I was in my ex-wife once. My husband also within me. Her within him, her also, it's possible, and him. I rode a bike here yesterday and walked where I was then today. One flew east and one flew west, deathward, away from death. One new leased and one flawed quest. Whither goest a witch of a wind, neither Madeline nor mandolin? The stench of my shit once within, I have to go, my dying mother said. My falling father gripped the lamp. Glenn's gone north on wide town car tires. Count K sleeps, his head spins down on the hard disk. Each Sunday, as Johann once before, Montonen's organ pipes mass into the light of the worlds of Spillville, solid state of Iowa. Perched in twilight, she's dying and he's crying, more or less morphed. We remain mortal, more so relatively remorseless. There. This year, as in others, couples pass by, solicitous and tender to one another. A blonde toad touches the broad freckled back of his big-breasted, handsome wife. Their child returns from the dark water and seeing his hand brushing shoe fly over her mother says, "Ah, back rub." Another woman whose plump arms seem distinct from her, swinging animate and outward from her hips in small arcs on their own, returns from the long dock with her dark-haired, mustachioed, handsome husband and gently slips her own hand into his, the hand now tamed, unmistakably willful, and her own. This morning, a brace of goldfinches rose from the grass when I rode by. Further along the road, children waded with their mother into the hedge of berries near the woods on the uphill slope toward the old stables, berrying. Startled like birds, the whole family dearly in need, dark-eyed waifs reached tentatively into the thorny wall, skinny arms extended from graying T-shirts with last year's superheroes faded and peeling. I pedal through the morning heat, here at here now unsettled, half hearing the ritual Bach, thinking, I was here once, wondering, why do we live? Not whether we should, not whether life has value in itself. It seems so. Nor whether the good we do others is deserving and good. Oh, it is. But to what purpose all this intricate and mindless passing of time alike, the fragrance of her returning? Why didn't you let me die?
While we're here, Michael, there was this glimpse of a photograph, the Lexia with a photograph. Could you tell us a bit more about that selection? There's 15 or 14 photographs.
Right. That particular one, I think, is actually from a cafe in Dresden, Germany, but it has on it a jonquil, behind the cafe wall, and I think to a certain extent it suggests both mortality and possibility, something that are themes in this, and kind of that feeling of distance from the moment.
And all of the photographs are made by you, taken by you.
They are made by me. They're found photographs to a certain extent because for the work I chose things that photographs that I'd taken on various trips or that seemed to fit the themes at hand. And I should at this point say that my father was a photographer. Most of his life he was a steel worker, and that's how he earned his living. But he was a photographer on weekends and when there were strikes, and to keep our family alive, but also to measure the beauty of the world around him.
Thank you.
We'll move to the next screen. Carrying. Am I bothering you? Good walk? Something on your mind? Some things on everyone's mind. Comes the rhythm of crickets. With them, light fading, little homily. Lately, I've been thinking how wrong we usually have it. So much talk of crime and selfishness, hurt and wrong, when really the world is incredibly full of caring. Just think of how much on any given day goes on, not just without anything going wrong, but with great caring. Little things we never give thought to, the ballet of buying newspapers, sneezing, and being blessed, dropping a pen and picking it up, edging between people at crossings, even the sullenness, the whispered shits and fucks pass mostly without incident. Everyone's always excusing, begging pardon, sorry, smiling. Almost every day, someone will touch you in the gentlest, most matter-of-fact way with no harm meant. I must say that this is a deeply ironic screen for me, given the kind of uncaring and violence and insurrection we've undergone in the past 2 weeks. And I'm deeply hopeful that we're on the edge of this kind of quotidian caring in our world and in our lives.
And now we can see the map view we talked about. And for the first time, we will use the navigation tools of the toolbar. Incoming and outgoing links are listed on the left and right. And Michael has chosen to explore, after the caring lexia, a series of acrostics, which we will now go to via this alternative mode of navigation of the work.
And I'd say before the screen opens for me that, as most people know, or many of you know, acrostics is a term for written versions of visual things. There's a famous acrostic poem by W.H. Auden about a painting in which Daedalus falls to the sea. An acrostic's an attempt to make language sea. And in this case, see death. First acrostic. Crossing in the fog in what season? The Hudson from Beacon to Newburgh. The bridge lights are feathery halos, successive pools of blurred honey, half-light swallowed by the damp. The slick roadway, black, patent, disappearing in ticked segments in the chill thickness beyond the headlight's tentative beam. The light turned back before its reach like an uncertain suitor. The river far below, black and silent and deep, turning here towards Storm King and the highlands, looming seaward and history heavy over us. Soaked wool sent to the Continental Army, ankles aching, smell of bruised Dutch apples and winter stone cellars, lavender of lovers' pale flesh through black knit stockings. Moans, or perhaps only the memory of foghorns and the bright hiss of new radials beneath the white car. Consciously, I can't read the word, consciously anxious, shallow breath and woeful, empty fear, just where the diaphragm lies upon the stomach, flesh clammy as if we walked this dark span in the dampness, neck and arm hairs pricked with a conscious sense of uncertainty about what comes next. Children half sleeping in the back seats of automobiles long ago in the stale silver haze of cigarette smoke. White lines disappearing in paved segments of indecipherable code. Small run in the calf of a black stocking, a muffled yell. Surrendering. This will be how it is to die. As we come to the second, I would suggest to everyone that you have a look sometime at the wonderful videos that the Venezuelan filmmaker Anita Pantin made along with the Canadian composer Bruce Pennycook of a number of these acrostics and some associated poems. Second acrostic, cup in plastic cup, domed lids, Russian wood dolls, bright lacquer, primary colors which seem foreign nonetheless, bells without clappers, babushka's apron, a series of them, even more girlish, the last small girl like a bright cherry, and the clean groove where each generation is slipped off at the waist. What if we enter it like dreams, in which, though sometimes frightened, we give ourselves over as if to water, a rim of suds forming along the slow swell, and then the inexorable surf, bellying up, born of the rocking babushka's swollen waters, wave like a soft claw over everything, skies soft turquoise, blurred through salt-crusted eyelids, the last touch of toenails dancing till the waves crashes over and lifts and plunges, then soured by the abrasive swirl that crabs feel over and over in the pounding hours of the dark morning, and from which the tortoises are said to crawl shoreward, ancient, venerable, fecund, after centuries of gestation spewing a paste of moist pebbles, jade caviar from their wombs, webbed claws, daubing over the smear with wet sand, moon in the quartz granules, Venus in the copper, each leg a gelatinous eye. Try to see this, that there is only this life, and then who dies will not be the one who fears dying, but someone beyond her, as if passing into a dream past dying, likewise beyond the fear of the sadness of the living who already mourns her. Add in that possibility that time is one, and we live each moment endlessly. This one, that, the pounding surf, the wet sand under the claw, cloudy plastic cup and cup. Try to recall all the bodies you were within or were within you. See how sweet it is, how shapeless, a baby's finger, sweetly dreaming. This is how it will be to die. I should say here that before we read the third acrostic, that you will have noticed in the map that the first two acrostics were linked to the run of the text, but the third and fourth and fifth ones have to be, not have to be, but are found coming from later in the story, where you can sort of see those biomass links coming in, excuse me, in the map. And so that means that these show up a little bit later and not in the run of the story. So We'll go back to the text. Third Acrostic. In autumn, the paths across the formal lawn near the library hum with distant sounds of sunlit conversation and slow bees, already weakened by the succession of cold nights and slowly warming mornings. Clover and timothy, tattered and dun, poplar jaundiced and sighing in its low branches, leather leaves around its massive trunk. And in the delta, at the crook of two paths, an autumnal scarlet shrub, pubic, placed there for this purpose. The annual show of this last song suggests the sweetness of pain at the end. Spiky, soft, symmetrical, cascade, sharp, conical fronds of pomegranate, red knives, lotus flower, domesticated landscape, ornamental scream. Marrow dulled with morphine, yet bone raw and in pain. Beyond pain, could the sleeper welcome even the confining dream? Is the last thing she feels worth feeling at all? Is one awful feeling with innumerable past feelings? Is this saying the same thing? Will we cling to anything? Witnesses look on. The procession passes to the chapel, wide sleeves and hoods flapping in a lately sprung breeze, clothing softly laughing, flutter of satin and fur, the plump velvet hats of dottori like caterpillars low waddle on a dry October path. Infant in a blue corduroy dress propped on a stroller. Pacifier on a velvet ribbon. Inside the stone chapel, the bright chords of Meyerbeer's March on the organ. Inside, the awful pain. The prophets enter in. The red shrub stands witness to feeling, sweetly screaming, well, this is how it will be to die. Waiting for the scream to renew, feeling the screaming. Fourth Acrostic. In the rocky ride along the desert updrafts rising out of El Paso's dust-brown grid of spotted landscape and ditch of a river, the Rio Grande's a concrete spillway of still brown water edged with barbed wire, surveillance roads, and fuel oil farms. My death fear constituted itself, as it has increasingly lately, in the mortality that we all share. Everyone here will one day die, I find myself thinking, and the realization brings with it an unbearable fondness for us all, a melancholy longing to comfort and be comforted, looking at the tanned ankle of the girl across the aisle, her leg pulled up under her as she gazes out the cabin window, her prominent ankle bone a rounded knob beneath smooth brown flesh. Thought such mortality should be worshipped among us. The ankle sucked like a displaced breast, not out of fetish or fantasy, but to honor its sad mortality and present beauty, kneeling in the aisle, tongue round this mesa, cheek against the cooling plain. I had the brief feeling, also increasingly common, that I do not fear death, just as I think I no longer have great hopes, but rather sweet quotidian ones, seemingly achievable. At that instant, the plane thumps and abruptly rocks with a thermal, and I wonder if we really faced a crash. And I began to feel fear. And I began to feel the inevitable final fear and anguish, whether that really would refute the lack of fear now at its prospect. Somewhere, a dim memory of melony peach light over small hills of opposite shore, coloring the cobalt river of twilight seen from a train window. Once, jogging, recalled my mother's plump and freckled breast. Suckling everything. This is how it will be to die. Fifth Acrostic. Outside, the milky light of the Milky Way is stitched through with constellations. Cassiopeia rises a full 10 degrees in the interval as a night fisherman casts, drawing long lines across the dark water, each cast etched an instant, then blurring away. A single comet flares in reflection across the still water at the far end of the lake, where at noon we saw muscular thrust of pike. The whole drama, moonrise and set, is conducted outside our view. A bat splashes in the cove, lost or thirsty. Fireflies slowly work the shore, fish slap and surface far off. Tires hum. Everywhere the busyness, the business of solitude, the constant events of the hidden world. In my memory, your gray hair dapples the pillow. Streaks of light in high, late clouds. My moon, your Chinese secrets are all gone. After moonset, rain on water, grinding black powder into ink for the inventory. A farewell to things. Peace. This is how it will be.
And the fifth acrostic ends the series, and that story container, is situated on the northbound arc, which is in the libretto set to represent a dream or mind. And now we will explore the eastward arc, which stands for life and the past.
Excuse me. Pleasant Lake, an unfinished novel. I should say here, as the screens are shifting, that Pleasant Lake is an actual place in upstate New York where I spent happy summers with my dear departed brother and his wife and family, where I did not meet a Polish exile couple, but I imagine I might have.
Myself, so I'm going to go back.
Sure.
There we go.
Okay. We're going to skip over Obi.
I'm getting to Obi right now. It's
okay.
As you can see on the screen, once the screen comes alive, for those of you who are looking at this, you'll see that there's a lot of notes. And I'm now in 22 short films, which takes us into notes, which gets us into the Obi story, if I'm not mistaken. Am I correct?
22 shorts will lead us to Magda's story in the present.
So I'll go back here, and I'm going to open up here, make current, open the space. Here's here. Here's history.
History, Pleasant Lake.
Pleasant Lake. Tapes 5 and 6, right? Heart begins soon. Begins soon, excuse me. There we go. Yeah. He stirs Obi. There we go. Those of you who work with twine know that this structure precedes twine by many, many, many decades. But you can see how the structure is oriented. And you have a lot of story in various places that you have to find. Okay.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the shout out to Twine, which I joined myself in. We're really happy that the Twine interface borrowed ours and continued to move it forward, and that numerous stories have been written in it, including some marvelous ones by our granddaughter, Grace Moon, but I won't go on there. I'm going to read He Stirs Obi.
Thank you.
Yeah. He stirs Obi. We are at Pleasant Lake. The wind eases through the alder and rattling oak and the chop slaps and crosshatches. The hummingbird makes its fruitless daily call upon the plastic lavender bells. The wasps continue their morning work on the shore mud, and in the silence, the baby startles. I whisper to him that it's only her stirring, for I know when I think too strongly of her, she comes. She cannot bear to keep from children. It must be so, for otherwise what comfort is death if you cannot do what you want? It is matins for me, In Obi, the baby sleeps. The lake is a sorry, the screen's taking a little delay for me. It is at matins for me, and Obi the baby sleeps. The lake is a radio of voices, and I, it appears, am a child napper. Postcard to her. Dear, I'm here, I wrote on a postcard the day we left, but then waited a week because the rhyme seemed so silly that I could not go beyond it. Dears, we are here, love you and obey. Love you and obey. Love you and obey. So the letter at first, he writes the postcard at first to his wife, his ex-wife, and then to the daughter behind, and it becomes a kind of forlorn love letter. Days of the woke. And so the time passes for us. My own day, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And on Friday, eating all the little flaps of half fish thus collected in a week. We're retreating into Catholicism, Obi. And he smiles, for he enjoys all my jokes. Saturday, Day, the stars, and the weekenders return to Pleasant Lake. And coming up here, we meet for the first time the Polish immigrant, Scrimshaw. Yep, he's squished down again and came into focus as the rain ceased into a tree drip. A man in green jeans and soggy velvet opera cape, his hand extended before him, ready to grip my hand from 20 yards away. Or maybe he just thought he was drowning after standing in that rain. At any rate, I matched his gestures from 15 yards out, and we commenced to docking. Soyuz and Solidarnosc, satellite and space shuttle under mercury light. He shook my hand so vigorously that droplets sprayed from his soaking hair. This is the fellow who's now the porn clerk, but was a poet and a quite respectable and respected man. A League of Nations. And so we started one of the least promising episodes of international communication since Princeton's Woodrow's League of Nations. Of course, he grunted, in the way that I'd come to detest. It's my name, Wojtek Scrimshaw. You calling in, right? I said, and finally we stopped shaking. Of course, he snapped again. I'm coming at night, but I'm very sorry I had chow too. Which of course explained it all, except we were nothing in the bottom of the first, and I still hadn't told him that was my name. Good old you coming in night. While I wait for the scrolling here, of course, Wojtek Scrimshaw is the way that Hugh decides to pronounce Wojtek Scrimshaw. My Polish not very good today, Marsh.
It is quite a difficult name in Polish as well. It's
okay. Thank you. That's a kind thing to say.
It's more Yiddish than Polish.
Yeah. And Deanie's doing a masterful job here of making herself around a spider web map, because we've chosen some distantly, not particularly closely separated screens, but in order to introduce both of the characters in the eastward arc. And we're coming up on meeting in a very important screen, Magda, who is the woman who's seeking to die and asking his help.
Should I help you, Dini? Yes.
Click here to
Rain of
cave.
Heart.
There it is. And when I clicked on it, it took me back to here. So what's happening is that the picture is a hot link. And I can't click on it, and to move the screen is a little bit tricky, so just give me one more second. And I think it's good for people to see the difficulty, and you have to know kind of, if you're trying to practice a work and rehearse, there's some real challenges when you're reading this as a novel.
But reading it as any hypertext is sort of effortless if you just let yourself go.
Yes, absolutely.
We're here trying to visit places that in a way you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, so I've just literally so I'm in notes now, and I'm going to go in one more time to notes, and there's Daltuno. So I'm going to click on that again to cave, and there's that, and I'm going to work really hard to move this screen out of the way and not touch the other screen. There it is.
We can be here maybe now, and then we go to Magda afterwards.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that. So here we've left, as would happen to a reader, not just simply in Dini's trying to help us find our way through the map out in a curious order. Here we go to yet another area, one of those areas of memory and what have you. And this one, part of really what I realized, having rediscovered the work through Mariusz's hard work, part of what I really realized was is what is now called an autofiction, autofiction, après les lettres here, because there are autobiographical elements in here, considerations of death and people dying, and in this case, a very important person in my life who went through it like a comet. Anne Johnstone was a researcher, an IBM researcher, a distinguished IBM researcher doing audio recognition things for telephones, for AT&T. I said IBM, she moved to AT&T. And she came to Vassar, where I was then teaching, to hear Stuart Moulthrop read his fiction because she was a great fan of his. She knew my work also. And we had a brief time where we knew one another, but she also got herself involved in the MOO, then run on the Brown University MOO site, a MOO then housed there, Carolyn Geyer's High-Pitched Voices, which was a place where women early involved in hypertext and digital literature conversed and made work together. And this is Anne's workroom in that MOO. You see a large sun-lit room looking out over a rambling English garden. The windows are open, and the smell of honeysuckle wafts on the warm spring air. There are 3 wooden desks. 2 are covered with half-finished bits of code, books, paper, jottings of stories and poems. And while we wait for a scroll, if it will, well, I don't have the whole thing, so we'll have to stop there. There is a longer text there, and it just somehow didn't come in for us. This is Anne's actual workspace on the MOO. I don't know. It must be a version drift because I could see it elsewhere. Out of it were links back to High-Pitched Voices and elsewhere.
And I'm moving to Rain of Hearts, which is here. And inside of that will be severity. I think we want to read not severity, but sorrows first.
Okay.
There we go.
And here we're looping back, just for everyone's benefit, to the other meeting where we're going to meet Vortex. Scrimshaw's wife, who is a major character in Twilight, Magda. In those days, Sorrows, in those days he was thick with prejudices, self-importance, anger, and grief. He thought the place would smell of sauerkraut, boiled potatoes, garlic kielbasa, and ammonia. He expected peasant hef and the Polish wife, a grimly tidy cottage, and television on all day. Instead, she made a space within white space, then vehemence. The pierogi were pillows filled with ivory grains of cheese, savory bites of wine-dark and cabbage, fluffy dill potato puree, one of each, a broad ribbon of thin sour cream sprinkled with fresh dill, banded the three crepes. He looked at the fraying ribbon of her shirt, and I'm going to stop the reading for a minute and say, that love and the text of Polish cuisine is a love that grew in my life and that led me to maybe perhaps the right way, but led me to love Polish culture so much that as much as I do, also growing up in a largely, or at least to a good deal, Polish city in Buffalo, New York. And so I was deeply honored when later in life, Mariusz did an electronic online study of my work and our interviews and interactions called Michael Joyce, Polish author. In any case, we'll go back to the story. He looked at the fraying ribbon of her shirt. "Is it crying?" she asked, and looked at her own chest, fingering the space where the freckled Indies lay. "I have a weeping mole," she said, peering down into her own shirt front. "Sometimes it weeps without me, mourning all the lost things of this world." She rubbed the space with her finger, leaving a red mark behind. "You've lost a good deal," he said. And while I'm waiting for the screen to refresh, you should point out for people who didn't know that after the Solidarity Uprising, there were a good many Polish refugees who were rehoused in the United States. Many of them lost the whole of their lives. "My family has," she spoke severely, the weeping mole brighter still. "Absolutely, you must help my husband." Then she softened. "Excuse," she said. "He needs your assistance. That is my fondest wish and why I wish to spend this time with you." Ardently, Shemsha's note from her had used this word, and because of it, he had agreed to see her. "My husband ardently desires freedom, and his soul is of the poet and the jazz." She left the empty plates before them, smears of creamy ivory, dots of cheese, and stray needles of dill marking what was gone. "Before your arrival here, for him there was nothing. Only working, selling strokes books, and drinking in his sorrows. Our son should not grow to see his father a broken man. You can help him with his applications for the university. That's nothing. What you must do is to hear his story. Help him write a version of what has happened to him. I'm asking this in every way I have possible, I implore you."
The songs.
Mm-hmm.
And I get to that by what is our strategy for that one, Mariusz?
We want now to go to the present moment to meet the Twilight Doctor.
Back to here?
Back to here and then to songs.
Okay.
And again, while this is happening, I want to say for everybody listening and watching in the present or the future, that this is a remarkable generosity and gift that people at ELL give to us who wrote these things. This ability to help us rediscover and move through these spaces and to put in all this effort and love, all this love for this literature that they're sustaining. So, as Mariusz just said, we're in yet another arc, really the last one we're going to look at of the story. And this is, as it said in our story so far, the first thing we heard, this involves Hughes accompanying Magda to try to find her own death, and then agreeing when she doesn't find the Twilight Doctor to help her die, to suffocate her to death, and then reneging on it, and so on. Songs. We are looking west and southward. From here the water is the color of dull stone and seems to extend without margin. Untroubled for this moment, at least by the wind, its gray cannot be said to merge with the pewter sky. On the contrary, across the horizon shimmers a semblance of the ancient thin seam between firmament and the waters. It's an illusion, of course, every bit of it, the unruffled water, the specter of expanse, the procreative seam, the hour before night, is a specter. We're now at the lull point on the edge of north itself, where a latitudinal shadow of weariness traces itself upon the globe of our desires. Frightened by the bleakness of the cold gray lakes stretching from Marathon to Duluth before us, we hold hands. For the last hour at least, as if by instinct, we have sought whatever warmth is left us to store against the long night. Hips brush as we make our way along the polished round stones of the beach. Arresting our progress across the shore, we puff warm air into cupped fingers. We reach the seam of water and sky for any light. We search the seam of water and sky for any light, whether an oar boat's running lamps or evening star. There is no light, and yet we think we hear something. There. Hear that? Somewhere far on the water? Bleeding metallic G-sharp modulating to an A-flat? The dull echo lingering on the silent edge of twilight, along the lost silver skim of the horizon, slowly drifting in toward the foam-laced rocks of the chill shore. Melodramatic? Romantic? Perhaps. It's not hard to lose track of your talk here at this superior, the darkening edge of the inland sea. The distant klaxon most likely isn't meant to signal us, of course, and yet the heart, even at full fathom within a warm body, cannot help but feel fear. Somewhere out there, urgent and unknown. A common wonder, it's an old story, Dunn's bell or Ariel's ding-dong drown man. The neon yellow lorry taking poor father to hospital, floating dead beneath all their pinball lights, electrodes and dials, the choke siren still groaning. What does the sailor hear? Alarm or call, making his way along the endless flat expanse, midships between stem and wheelhouse? What is it he thinks himself called to? Work? Sleep? Or warm food? Does he sniff blood, grease, or rot? The damp, salt smell of shore or nocturnal sperm? Is what he hears between the klaxon bleats the only cradle of chips, oily cradle of chips frying in the galley? Or flesh on fire, muffled panic in the dark hold below? Does he feel swell rising, storm welling, fog descending, or merely the dry blast of flame from the bulkhead hatch? Does he mark skiff's end or shipmate's death? Dream of home or tavern, wife's plump breast or whore's hard, the forbidden flank and muscle of other men, the taste of whiskey? Oh, listen, birds far from shore, who can know? Who cannot but want to, hearing this sound? This is why I love to come here, north to me. Calliope's funnel of the world's sounds, ears, here, as likewise here too shine and dance northern lights to all eyes. I don't know, do we scroll more? Is there more here? Yeah. I think, by the way, that, and this is because I haven't read this in so long, that the Hugh and Magda watching there also merged with Glenn Gould's watching along along Lake Superior. He used to drive up along the Superior in his Lincoln, his wide town car tires, to sit by that shore. And now we're back to you and Magda. The end. Of course, it's not really the end, but it's the end. She had called it a death mask. With a Q, she said, like Pope's-Troy. She smiled weakly. There's a pun buried there, she said. Appropriately, he said. And now, she lay before him in the stale lemon light of the hotel room, the mask begun. Her hand in his, a dove with lapsing pulse, her head firmly wreathed in the milky cloud of a knotted plastic dry cleaning bag, which, once she had lapsed into unconscious, he had fixed around her according to her instructions. Inside the cloud, she was resting restlessly, her eyes closed but troubled beneath the lids. The room was yellow with the light, its witnessing walls imprinted with the eyes of lost maples, the plastic membrane bunched round her hair like a turban and then smoothed into a transparent window at her face. She swam far beyond the window and began to drown, her troubled breaths pulling in tighter, tighter. Now his breath pained him. The radiator began to knock, and far away a klaxon sounded over the inland sea. The Twilight doctor had sailed away to Montreal and couldn't see her. After the phone call brought this news, she folded into a swoon of depression. He held her for an hour and 11 minutes before she made the decision to go. At first she trembled in his arms, so weak he thought the death she wished for would come to her on its own. He felt an absurd resentment stir, as if a husband cuckolded in his sleep. An hour passed, and then another 3 minutes until he felt her begin to stir as if some blind creature stirring in an ocean trench and about to rise. Gradually she broke through the surface of her stupor, a thin strength returning with it a thicker resolve. They would have to undertake the death mask. Solicitous, she patted his hand. He would have to help her, have to fetch the sack. Waiting for the screen. Mind you this, she whispered. Returned to some lost syntax, Lithuanian dusk. She had packed the kit for the death mask in a velvet sack, red as a womb, she said, in her suitcase, the velvet smelling dusty as a stage curtain. In it a green globe of duty-free cognac, jolly as a friar's belly, cushioned by the dry cleaning bag which had seemingly been folded again and again until it was soft as a cloud. Shroud, he thought, the rhyme. Also folded there a square of rice paper, sepia ink in a delicate minuscule, the East European hand lending an exotic air to the writing. Death's recipe, she said. It seemed so ugly to think of dying from a photocopy. Further inside the velvet sack, the makings of the recipe, an amber plastic vial of capsules with a childproof top, the gelatin capsules in semaphore colors, citrus, yellow, and scarlet, to be taken after a light meal, so as to avoid vomiting, the recipe said. Inside the vial, the faintly bitter scent of walnuts. A light meal, water crackers and a tiny jar of marmalade, its lid sealed with black foil, pilfered from the room service tray of a much better hotel in better days than this. Soft cheese, vacuum packed in an oval plastic tub. La vache qui rit. Are you certain you can do this? She asked. She set a small meal out like a sacrament, a woman's skill. You won't be killing me, she said. He nodded. The pills and brandy accomplish, she said. The veil merely consummates it. All my life I have lived with words. Fragrant, lapses, tortoise, ardent. Momentarily, he thought she had said consecrates it. He thought she had said accomplice. She wrapped the plastic gracefully into a turban over her head, almost primping, then demonstrated how he should slip the veil down over her face and at the last, securing it at the back of her neck. There were pale golden hairs in the place where she said he should knot the plastic. Her fingers were ancient marble, a faint mottle of violet here and there, texture of cheese, cold as stone. If you feel comfortable doing it, you could pinch it over the nostrils, but this, of course, is not necessary. She lifted the veil back up over her head. In the knowing way a woman might remove her lingerie before a lover, she searched his eyes for sadness. Have we ever been lovers, he wondered. It was as if she showed him how to please her. Hood of the clitoris, sweet as a communion wafer under his tongue. She looked like a chrysalis. The air was disappearing, and he thought he saw her smile. He imagined her eyes. In the yellow light, her head in the plastic bag took on the ghastly sheen of a moist cabbage. It was warm in the room, and there was no pulse when he made the phone call. Q. We will have to charge you with an offense to the Crown, the constable said. I am charging you with abetting a death. He was very nervous. No, something different, excited. A beautiful woman, shrouded in silver on a bed before him, her pearl lips edged in blue, so near death, having slipped free, thinking of the odd man parked in the stifling green glow of the Lincoln overlooking the lake in a world full of troubles. Magdalena whispered, her voice so dry it wasn't clear whether he heard her. You could charge every mother in Ontario on that account. She'd been breathing again for some time, the edge of blue leaving her lips, the moon pallor leaving her face. When it was over, it wasn't clear. It had never been. He had never been. Whether he panicked or simply misjudged how much it took to die. He knew one day she would ask him. The EMT arrived with a gurney and a small blue canister of oxygen and clasped the mask to her mouth with thick fingers. I had already removed the veil. I did not want them to see you like that. At first she moaned under the mask, but then she suckled the cold air as greedily as a child sucks the breast. The man smoothed a blue woolen blanket over the gurney. Slowly her eyes sailed back from the mist of the faraway place that surely no one has ever seen or will see again. The men watched her return in giddy silence. This is what sirens were. After her eyes cleared, her voice returned, mordant and dry from the choking in the oxygen. Her words arrived choppily, as if an interrupted radio transmission. He's innocent, she rasped. This I did while he was out at the tavern. He came back to save me. Her breasts were soft hills under the blue wool. Her eyes said, why didn't you let me die? Yet it wasn't so bitter as it sounds, not so sad. She knew he loved her. She squeezed his hand. You are my second mother, her eyes said. Your name is Johann Gottlieb, and I am the Countess Chrysalis.
Michael, I don't know how to thank you for reading to us this long stretch of text of the end, which is really not the end. On the story space map, we can see that just next to the end, there's a lexia called A Beginning, and that segment actually does not lead to any other, and we are encouraged as readers to start exploring the work again and look connections, and this is just really a beginning of the proper exhaustive reading of this text. Thank you so much for reading aloud that long segment, the end, and our time is up, and now a time for Q&A.
Good.
We will be gathering questions from the chat, and while we do that, also Astrid Enslin and Dini will be asking questions.
May I mention that Hugh Burns, who was my professor and actually was my colleague and my chair in my department at Texas Women's University, is here with us today. He was the person who brought Michael Joyce to our campus back in 1997. Michael, do you remember that? I picked you up at the airport.
Oh, my Lord, I do, and I remember you, Hugh. God, it's good to know you're there.
I know, and you know what's interesting is that I picked you up at the airport. It was a long drive from the Dallas-Fort Worth airport to Denton, Texas that afternoon, and Janet Murray's book had just come out, Hamlet on the Holodeck. And you and I were just raving mad about it, and I want to tie that into something that Astrid says. here in the chat. She says, how could anyone ever claim that hypertext wasn't immersive? And that was the very thing that you and I talked about on the way back from the airport. How she had missed the whole notion of what immersiveness could be in a literary hypertextual environment. And it was Hugh that brought you here to have that conversation. I brought you there to have that conversation, so I'm delighted to have that. I'd like for you to respond to this comment that Hugh and Astrid.
Yeah. First of all, once again, I'm going to say I'm delighted that Hugh is here, especially since one of our grandchildren is now in the Air Force, which is neither here nor there, except Hugh and others will recognize why. Yeah, I mean, I know what Janet was about when she was making that case, and really trying to argue for holodeck and for game worlds and augmented and visual and virtual realities, and thankfully, Danny, as we grow older, we make our peace with those kinds of moments. But sure, for me, when I first described afternoon, when people asked me, I said what I wanted them to think of was that you could move the screen back and you could pull it out and reach in it, and that words would be the medium for doing that. And then obviously, for me, being Irish American, Irish, having a name of the great musician of the English language, the immersiveness of the music of words brings us in, and like that klaxon calls us in a way that we don't know what it is. And so, yeah, I mean, once again, I know what Janet was up to. It was a brilliant book in its own way, but the kind of work that you've been doing here at ELL is looking at something quite different.
Let me mention, too, thank you for that response, and let me mention that there's some folks here online that are working with the Electronic Literature Repository Rebuild, this phase 3 that we're doing right now, and we plan to have it finished May 15th, and one of the people here is Katya Ferensky, who's working with me as the writer for all of the writing in this repository, all of the introductions and captions and all of that, and she was also in my game class last semester as a terrific writer herself, and has produced a game in Twine, in Form 7, interactive fiction game. So she's here, and you'll be talking to her directly as we're working on your collection in the repository. So I just wanted you to meet her in this space. So Astrid Ensign has a great question. She says, I have a question about your connection with Glenn Gould and his interpretation of the Goldberg variations. Something you and I mentioned earlier. Can you please talk more about this inspiration?
Yeah, sure. Excuse me. Something we talked about before we began here is that for at least two, Carolyn, my wife Carolyn and I were trying to figure out the other night just how long this was for, but for at least 2 and maybe 3 or 4 years, I listened to the Goldberg variations every single day as I would go out walking when I lived in Michigan with my ex-wife Martha and our boys. And every day, the Goldbergs imprinted themselves on me in such a way that I can even now remember the places where I was walking when certain of them would play. I get very taken with the difference between the, and for anybody who wants to read this brilliantly spelled out, I recommend Dave Chicarico's electronic book review essay on Twilight. But I get very taken by the difference between the 2 recordings of Goldberg variations. The one that made Gould famous and brought him to everyone's attention in 1955, which was 33 minutes long. The one in 1981, just before his death, which was 45 minutes long. And for me, that seemed to be the difference between a young man's view of what lies ahead and a man of a certain age, especially a man on the edge of his own mortality, maybe not knowing it, who valued the kind of passing of time in those ways. Add to that the fact that I grew up in Buffalo, New York, on the border of Canada, very close to Canada. I felt as fond about Canada as I did about the Polish people. And Glenn Gould, of course, is a Canadian artist. His idea of North, a sound piece is an oral AURAL hypertext of extraordinary quality. You can still find it online. And so that combination, and Gould is in the story. We did have one or two places where we saw him. Gould is going to Superior as Magda and you are, and they're passing in the night. There's a wonderful section, and I'm saying this more as the newly informed reader of Twilight than its author. There's a wonderful section where Gould is driving up along the shore in Marathon and listening to Petula Clark, as he used to all the time. He said for print that his favorite artist, other than himself, I suspect, was Petula Clark. He loved Downtown, of course, her famous song, but he loved her whole canon. And then he listened to it in his big Lincoln as he drove. And Glenn Gould was, of course, famously a loner. And so you can think of him inside this Lincoln listening to Downtown and driving to the edge of the sea, inland sea, the Superior.
I'd like to ask about difference between East and West arch of narrative. I found that the text of the past, the Hughes narration is quite different in style from what we can see 10 years back. Pleasant Lake, as we know in the text, is labeled as unfinished novel.
Yes.
Does this mean that there was a 10 or more different years of difference between these two writings?
You're a wonderful critic, and you know I've appreciated that always. Sure, this gave me the opportunity to do the same thing that in my mind Gould had done with the Goldbergs, and to take a novel that I'd been working on for almost a decade, and that was contained and that had been interrupted really by events of my life, deaths in my own life, my mother and father, changes in my life, my children growing up, all sorts of things. But to use that, and also to use the sense, the growing, the difference between a refugee couple, the ways that so many refugees have to move from their professional standing as engineers, poets, you name it, toward menial positions and what have you, and then through their time in this country regain a new and different kind of stature and what have you. So those two, and the idea of Magda and Wojtek looking for a new life in this kind of very conventional narrative, although it jumps here and there, and of Hugh and Magda looking for death in yet a new a narrative that renews itself, as you, Mariusz, pointed out so beautifully, where the end is right next to the beginning, and the way to make the beginning is you have to go and start again. So those two things together, to me, were kind of, I call Twilight, I used to tell my students it's bargain basement Proust, that instead of a Madeline, there's the bicycle tire, and having been here once again. But this aspect of it makes it a bargain basement, Glenn Gould's Goldberg variations.
You highlight it in yellow, so it's easy to find that Lexia in here.
Good.
Other questions from people? I like that you. One wonderful thing that's come out of this also, besides this event, is that we have two new writings about you. One about this work, and one is from, of course, Mariusz, and the other is, of course, from Astrid. And I think it would be good for both of them to point out some of the highlights of their focus of their essay. So, Mariusz, you want to talk a little bit about what you wrote about, and then we can ask Astrid to talk about her essay as well. Mariusz?
Oh, apologies, I haven't heard. I have
That's
some
okay.
connection issues. I've got a question. Is it now the time?
Well, I was going to say, if you wanted to talk just a bit about your essay, which was so excellent, the focus of your essay.
Right. Okay. In this essay, I've just summarized the current overviews that have accumulated over the 20 years of reception. And of course, I quote Dave Chicorico and Astrid Enslin, and I think the most important aspect of Twilight, as I present in this, that elusiveness of meaning. Chikoriko tells us about that totaling, signifying wholeness that we strive for, but actually, as he quotes Peter Brooks, it turns into a deferral, endless deferral of meaning.
Your connection is pretty weak, Marius. You're coming in from London? Yeah. So Marius, you probably are not hearing us, but I think you're having a hard time connecting. So I'd like to...
But my question...
Astrid, how's your connection?
You hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Marius,
Okay.
I think, is disconnecting, so why don't you go ahead and ask your question and comment?
Yeah, I can, while Marius's connection is being reset, I can say a few words about how I read the work, but which was a long time ago as well. But what interested me in my book, Canonizing Hypertext, which came out in 2006, what interested me was how, you know, hypertext and other forms of early electronic literature developed, and how especially the semiotic aspects of them developed from sort of more text-based to multimedia, but also to the shift towards what could now be called an early form of AI, where the text as a machine, to use Espen Arsad's terminology there, becomes cybertextual. And of course, you also have the game aspect there, except that with literary hypertext, it was always meant to be a lot more haphazard and creative and serendipitous. So that's what interested me in this work, where I placed it somewhere on the margins between sort of second generation, third generation digital literature. That's what fascinated me, because you feel you are in charge and in control. You know, there's this sort of navigation, you know, the little button that you saw with the different directional arrows, and you think, oh, this makes sense, and it may for a while, but then it doesn't. You know, it becomes very random, and that's partly what makes this work so immersive from a navigational point of view, because you do want to engage with this game. You, as a reader, you want to know whether you can, you know, come to grips with the meanings and structures that you are encountering. That's what fascinated me about this work when I read it. On top of the emotional depth. I mean, you know, hearing it again now, you know, I just can't believe how how moving it is, and especially against the backdrop of, as you said, recent developments in American politics, and especially yesterday's event, which brought tears into my eyes. You know, it's just such a highlight. The whole sort of couple of days have been full of highlights. So just want to thank you there. But you know, if you would like to comment on my thoughts here, and then maybe add a little bit to that, because I'm sure that a lot of people who are watching this back, or who are attending this event, may not be fully aware of just how impoverished compared to today the computational expressive landscape was at the time, right? It was everything seemed clunky. So that was such a groundbreaking, you know, achievement that you made there with your work.
Thank you, Astrid. I'm deeply moved, and even more, I'm, as always, when I confront your work, informed. I learned to see my own work differently. You know, in hearing you, I think maybe indeed I was responding to a certain degree, first of all, to the work around me, the Tinek people, Stuart and others, and Jay Bolter, who's already veering toward augmented reality and what have you, as he has been, and my students, of course. but also maybe reacting to the criticism that we faced, the first wave hypertext faced, that, okay, this seems to be free, but you're in control all the time. And it's really the author that's, people would say, oh, the author's even more in control. This is a terrible trick. It's, it's fascist the way that it is. It's offering freedom and then, in a form, and then taking it away, guiding everything. So yes, to a certain extent, this became a machine. Yes, became. I'm trying to find the Foucault word I'm blanking on my Foucault, but which is a funny thing to do. It became an apparatus, something with the random links and with the possibilities that it could be game-like. And the way you talked about it, and hearing you talk about it, Astrid, I thought also about this early pachinko-like, from Pong onward, where you think you would get you think you'd get the logic of the game, and then it would be going off the rails and what have you. So there was that, yeah. And before I finish this response, I do want to say, I hope that everybody else, when poor Mariusz's sound went away, heard the same glorious musical sounds. It was like an angel descended from the Glenn Gould world and played piano keys and plunked guitar strings. Probably Mariusz isn't happy about that, but...
Did I turn into a swan song at some point?
No, it turned into very much a kind of etude.
May I say something? John and I were talking about this work on our drive up to campus, and how, I'm teaching a digital storytelling class this semester, and we're using Twine and various other, forms, mediums to express ourselves, and the richness of the illusions, the cultural illusions, the richness of the linguisticness of your work, the story itself. So much of that is lost in contemporary media work, not literature per se, but in the Twine works I'm reading and other types of works. They're wonderful, I'm not being critical, but this layering of cultural illusions, the use of language, the linguistic quality is just superb. And it's hard to teach that today because it requires a lot of reading and study. And it's hard to get that in a media class. And I'm hoping my students are hearing me now say this. But I was, thinking about Dante and how there's so much work done on providing scholarly editions to explain to people 1,000 years later, or whatever, how many years, 800 years later, who these people are and why they're put in hell, who these people are and why they ended up in heaven, right, in paradise. And we don't have that kind of scholarship happening for this work. And I was just imagining, Michael, in 100 years, somebody wondering about the Polish uprising and the Velvet Revolution and the fall of the Iron Curtain and AIDS and all the things that you wrote about, and even an afternoon of story. We're losing those cultural touchstones, and how we can recreate them. It's some sort of scholarly edition, and this work screams for it, with all of the allusions you provide.
Well, I hope you don't expect me to answer that question.
No, but I just want to say, I just think it's something to point out,
No, I understand. And I really try very hard in my life not to be an old fart. And to say, oh, it's the Instagram generation or anything like that. But there is a sort of a cultural richness that I think we're going to regain again. I have another broadcast, another time we could have this discussion. I think the COVID pandemic has taught us to seek a richness of a kind that we're only just now understanding, in the Zoom world or what have you, that will lead to these kind of multivocal, polyphonic understandings of time and culture and what have you. The other thing that is, I heard you pose the question, didn't you, that I thought about it. Unfortunately, I can't remember the man's name, but there's this wonderful fellow, I've seen him twice. My colleague Mark Amodio at Vassar brought him in twice, who performs Beowulf in the original Old English. He gets up there with a lute-like instrument and he just pronounces it. And I remember the first time I saw it, that I didn't understand a word and didn't even know the references and what have you. But then that damn music of the language took over, and I swear I could understand everything he was saying. And I suspect what we're looking for is something like that, that the music and the visual richness and the polyvocality of multimedia, or whatever we're calling it these days, media culture, social media, etc., that those things will carry us through, and that kind of underlying rhythm, the kind of variations that Bach presented to Glenn Gould and now Lang Lang and so many others, and that's the hope. I mean, we can't be tutoring, we can't be doing Cliff's Notes. It won't be real culture if we're doing that. We have to assume that the things that matter, and that's the great thing of having began all of this collaborating with the classic scholar Jay Bolter, who thought of millennia as weeks, and time is ample and copious and open, and the things that matter, as we find out with Dante, the things that matter come back into their own richness. So I'm not pessimistic about it.
Yesterday's event, the inauguration and the party last night, with the reintroduction of the arts and humanities as a central focus.
I thought so.
Oh my God!
Finally, poetry has a place again, and it's been reframed.
And then having
it's been made younger, and it's been made colorful, and just wonderful.
And having Yo-Yo Ma perform, having classical music back into the fold was such a nice.
By a young woman who, I'm sorry, could combine spoken word with the deepest rhythms of poetry throughout time, and with music, and that was a remarkable event, as was all of the rhetoric around it. I agree with the two of you.
But your work harkens to all of that, and I think that's one of the reasons why I keep going back to what we call early hypertext. And this work, I as much as I love Afternoon of Story, this one is so elegiac and so beautifully written. The sound quality, I think it's just superb. I'm totally gushing now, but that's just how I feel about the work. I think Mariusz has something more intellectual to say.
There is also that group of segments called Sleepy, 13 notes with disrupted syntax, grammar, very Irish, I would say, dreamlike stream of consciousness. And Susanna Tosca mentioned that homage to James Joyce that you as author pay in Twilight and Symphony. We've seen that in Afternoon a Story as well. And I quite often think that Twilight and Afternoon are works that James Joyce would write if he would live with us today, and that might probably be some goal that Michael Joyce put himself in this 20, 30 years ago. Would you tell us more about Joycean connections and that homage in Twilight?
Sure. First, thank you for that over-the-top comment. But I approach James Joyce with great humility. I first decided to be a writer when somebody told me there was a writer named Joyce, and I thought that was remarkable. Oh, you could be named Joyce and write? Because it came from an Irish Catholic family, working class family. I didn't know much about that. It came to love poetry and literature, but I didn't know much about it. That Joyce branch is Cork people. Mine are Mayo, County Mayo, from a little town, a little crossroads, a little farm crossroads. My great-grandfather came to Pennsylvania as a coal boy. He pushed the cart up from the coal mines till he hurt himself, and then became a hotel keeper, which is pretty Joycean. Okay, so with that background, I'll say that I've always felt very much in the position that, to tell you the truth, Umberto Eco put me in real life, live, from the stage of the End of the Book conference in San Marino, when he looked down on the third row and said, we're fortunate to have here Michael Joyce, who convinces us that hypertext is like jazz, and to also have the memory of the real Joyce, James Joyce. And I thought, yeah, that's right. I'm the kind of jazz bricolage guy, and then there's the real Joyce, and I'm perfectly happy with that kind of connection. Those voices come from family. I was in a very large Irish family with a mother and father who talked art, and you know, go back to Deanie's observation, talked about books, talked about poetry, talked about politics, talked about these sorts of things, as we all did around the table, and with brothers and sisters who were and are brilliant, and you know, a brother now who's a great preacher, a sister who is a famous archaeologist, et cetera, et cetera. All my brothers and sisters had this kind of eloquence. So it comes out of a matrix. It comes out of the sea. It comes out of the waves. But of course, Dave Chicorico says that I keep nodding to how there's only one story, and it's the story of the return and the story of the Odyssey, and in some sense there's only one writer, and it's James Joyce, and amen.
Mm-hmm. I think we're almost out of time, but I do want to mention a couple of things. First, I'm sitting here in my lab with a mask on, and no one can see me. And I'm a voice coming disconnected from my body, a disembodied voice. Marius is leading this from London. Astrid's coming in from now her new home in Bergen, Norway. And of course, Michael's coming in from upstate New York. So
near the Hudson River. Near the Hudson River,
which is a beautiful area. So we're all coming in different places. We're using YouTube as the connection for the live broadcast, but the four of us are communicating via Zoom. So we've got a kind of a strange setup here, and I posted some pictures on Twitter for everyone to see so you can understand the complexity of this arrangement that the pandemic has caused. I do also want to mention our next traversal is the one led by Astrid. Astrid, do you want to mention that one coming up?
It's going to be in small and large pieces with and by Catherine Kramer, a key person in the the whole Eastgate story. She worked very closely with Mark Bernstein at Eastgate, and has had her hand in a lot of these historical texts, and we will hopefully learn a lot more about her diverse roles in this in this entire world, but it's also a beautiful text to read and re-experience. It kind of has a place in the long canon of works referring back to Alice in Wonderland, but there are many other wonderful aspects about this. There's a little bit of Kafkaesqueness about it too. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I want to thank Deanie and her team again for making all this possible.
And we're going to be putting on a launch party for the work that Marius has been doing with Michael Joyce with Twilight. Marius, do you want to talk a bit about that project?
We are at the finalizing stages of the online port of Twilight to be accessible for everyone for free and in English. It's based on an original online port that accompanied the Polish translation of Twilight Symphony, but there will be some surprises. There will be some, I hope, new functionalities, and there will be a lot to celebrate. For the first time in 25 years, the wider audience will be able to read this amazingly beautiful work online with the whole mechanics that were implemented in the original Story Space edition, and we are really looking forward to it with Michael. He of course knew the Polish edition before that, but he couldn't read it in Polish, and now he will be also enjoying that text and reconnecting with it again for good.
Very exciting. Michael, thank you for your time today. It's always a pleasure to see you and to hear you read your work and to have this for posterity. For those of you who are listening online on YouTube, this video will be put online at the lab's video site. We'll be cutting it into smaller chunks, so it's smaller little chunks to read. And then all of this will be put into the book, Volume 4, Rebooting Electronic Literature, which we publish probably at the end of the summer. So thank you, John Barber, for your sound work, Greg Philbrook for your wonderful OBS, managing all of this tech today. Holly, thank you for the art you produced for this and for being online, and Kathleen for all the Twitter posts that you've been doing. I've been following you, so thank you so much, everybody, for your help. Marius and Astrid, I'll see you soon. And Michael, thank you.